figured I would just do a little bit of a different entry for tonight, especially because of the occasion of today. I don't know if you realize it, but today is the 238th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution of the United States. September 17th, 1787. This picture right here is a picture of the event that was made many, many years ago. That's obviously a copy of that picture. But anyways, I'm just excited to be here with you all tonight, and welcome everyone to another good evening, I hope, of excitement and learning and enjoyable camaraderie. Allow me once again to thank the Asa Waters Mansion through the Executive Director, Tracy Perath, and the incredible volunteers, the Friends of the Asa Waters Mansion, for the opportunity to be with you for this evening, for the third lecture on the government of our country. I may be the mouthpiece for these lectures, but I've had considerable assistance from former students, Carrie Chapman, who helped craft the virtual presentations to accompany the lectures, Kevin Chrysopoulos, who's normally been filming our event and typically has, I don't know if you know this or not, but the first two lectures are now on YouTube, so you can watch them or share them with your friends, neighbors, and family. Tonight, we welcome Jeff Dorr, who is filming tonight's third lecture. And of course, if anyone knows Jeff, we know that he's our all-purpose, every person knows in the town of Millbury. He can do everything and anything for everyone in the town of Millbury. Jeff is our go-to. So I want to thank all of the people involved in helping to make this a possibility. Although we start off with a review of the last week's lecture and finish the lecture with a look at the additional principles and rights, we will end with a look at the institutions established by the framers. Just a slight reminder that the Massachusetts Center for Civic Education is our organization that primarily features, our programs for the students, fifth grade, middle school, as well as high school. And our mission statement is to develop generations of responsible, educated, and involved members of society by promoting civic learning, active engagement, and significant contributions to democracy. As you can see, our mission statement is intended to be as broad as possible to engage as many of our Americans as possible. The Citizen Lyceum, as you know, it reflects the Greek tradition of the Lyceum movement and the American Lyceum movement, which began in Millbury in 1826. And I want to have a shout out to Sharon Anderson, who this week on Facebook, representing the Millbury Historical Society, had a nice piece illustrating and explaining how the American Lyceum movement began in Millbury. And if you haven't missed that, I think that's a really nice explanation of how the Lyceum movement did indeed start here in Millbury. So last week we reviewed the three major principles underpinning the government of the United States. And the three major principles are liberalism, republicanism, and constitutionalism. Anyone want to take a stab at explaining any one of these three principles? So liberalism, reflects the notion of natural rights or individual rights that we spoke about. the notion of popular sovereignty, consent of government, social contract, those are terms that relate to the fact that in our system of government, what we're trying to do is to devote the fact that Americans are interested in promoting our individual rights. The republicanism, yes, sir?
Oh, the constitutionalism was the rule of law.
Good. Rule of law, the notion of limited government, absolutely. Very good. Excellent. And republicanism?
Law, no, law and order. Law and order. They were the ones that would enforce it. Constitutionalism.
Okay, republicanism, okay, has its basis on representation of government. So, for example, we live in a country of 340 million people. I'm not sure that all of us would be ready to vote on every single bill or policy in order to vote on it. So what do? We elect representatives in order to do that work for us. But we have a role in whom we elect in order to do that particular role as efficiently as we would like them to do that. So that role of representation is part of that Republican notion that we're trying to inculcate through that particular issue. But there's a second feature, and the second feature is if it's a Republican government, the aim is also to allow for people to expect that our representatives are governing for the common good. That even though we as individuals would like to see certain end results benefiting us, we also expect that the representatives are going to need to make decisions that impact the common good, because the common good is going to be what is going to effectively make the government work best. So we have to often recognize that our own individual wishes, wants, even our needs, may not always be reflected, by the decisions in which the representatives make their particular decisions. So these three terms, which we will talk about at the end of the evening, are going to be very important as they become the fundamental principles upon which our government is based. We discussed British influences last week as well and looked at how these principles found their way into our U.S. Constitution. So I took a few that we talked about: separation of powers, checks and balances, trial by jury, independent judiciary, amendment power. We could have talked about veto, the supremacy clause, and different others. But some of these, we saw through the British influences, but we also saw many of these through some of what the colonists turned now American citizens through their experiences in the fight for American independence. We also discussed the Bill of Rights, and in so doing, we discussed the First Amendment rights, we discussed the right to bear arms, we discussed the many rights, for the accused, as well as the principle of federalism, whereby we have the states that do what they can do and rights that they have, or the types of opportunities that they have to govern versus, what the national government has, what they can do. So this evolution, if you will, of principles over time, these aren't the only ones. And this is where we ended our talk last week. There are other key principles that have come since then or were not mentioned within the Constitution or the Bill of Rights that we want to talk about before we get into the discussion on institutions. So other key principles that we want to discuss, one of them you probably remember learning in your earlier years, is one called judicial review. Now, judicial review was never part of the Constitution, but that doesn't mean that it didn't previously exist in other governments. It also doesn't mean that it wasn't discussed at the Constitutional Convention. The idea of judicial review is, well, here are laws that are being passed by the legislature. Here are policies that are being done by the executive branch. Are they constitutional? Are they living up to the way in which the Constitution was written? Who's going to look into that? So these things, okay, were discussed and had been dealt with in previous types of government. But that wasn't determined at the Constitutional Convention. James Madison had raised the issue of, well, maybe we could have a committee of revision within the Congress. That was not treated favorably at all, okay, by the delegates at the Constitutional Convention. And so what they ended up doing is not deciding. What ended up happening was a court case called Marbury versus Madison. I could spend a great deal of time discussing that court case with you, but I won't. Just what I will say is that John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1803, made the determination that the decision-making of the court is to interpret the laws. If that is the decision-making of the court, then it makes perfectly good sense for the court to be able to tell whether or not the laws are constitutional or not, and therefore determining what the law is, to use his words. So the result of that decision was that we determined the principle of judicial review was going to be a principle that would be in the hands of the judicial branch of government. Now, if you want further study on this, it's a very exciting case because of the political nature of it as well as the legal nature of it. But for our purposes, okay, just understand that the judicial review became a very essential tool, if you will, of the judicial branch as a result. I'm going to ask for a brief discussion on your part, and that is, you may have wondered why there is no discussion of voting rights within the Constitution. One of our most essential, if not the most essential right that we have. Is there anybody here who might want to guess or may have an idea as to why voting was not mentioned at all within the original Constitution? Yes, sir.
Women weren't allowed to vote, but not everyone was allowed to vote.
Well, that's not true, because people in various states did have the right to vote, and they were voting, okay, on their leaders within their states, and they were doing voting within those states. But to your point, you are correct, okay, women did not have the right to vote at that time in any of the states. So there were limitations on voting. That's definitely true. Yes?
You had to have land to be able to vote.
That is true in many states, and that differed from state to state. And that may be part of the answer. Yes?
Elections were left up to the states.
Exactly. So the whole purpose, okay, of not addressing the issue of voting was that every state had different rules as to who could vote. And so the result was you didn't touch something that was going to obviously, okay, cause an issue from state to state. So you had states, for example, that had religious qualifications. You had states, okay, that had property qualifications, as you mentioned, and these property qualifications varied from state to state. So rather than touch that, they merely allowed the states to make those determinations on their own. So nothing was mentioned with regard to the voting, okay, voting rights. Now, most of us, okay, are probably somewhat familiar with some of the voting rights that have been achieved through the amendments of our Constitution. But before we get to that, you should know that property rights, as well as religious qualifications, had disappeared by the 1820s and 1830s by most states. So by the 1820s and the 1830s, almost all the states had gotten rid of religious qualifications as well as property qualifications for voting. However, we still had serious difficulties with regard to other qualifications. So we needed, like, the 15th Amendment after the Civil War, even though the 14th Amendment, which we'll be talking about a little bit later, the 14th Amendment was meant to allow for all blacks to be able to vote. There were many southern states who were making as many difficulties for that to occur, thus making it necessary for the 15th Amendment to be passed. And the 15th Amendment, as you can see from the wording, specifically indicates, okay, that all males would be allowed to vote by 1870, and it was specifically geared to black men who were being denied the right to vote. Then, of course, we have the 19th Amendment, and look how long it took, if you will, for the 19th Amendment to get ratified, even though they had begun working by the 1850s, the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and the work that women were doing in order to maintain and to get the right to vote. It wasn't until 1920 that the 19th Amendment was finally ratified in order for women to get the right to vote. In the Amendment 24 was not, okay, resolved until the early 1960s, and that was simply, okay, to not make it possible for poor people to not vote. Because many states, particularly those in the South, were charging people to be able to vote. They called them poll taxes, so you'd have to pay a tax in order to be able to be able to vote. By the Amendment 24, that was scrapped, and that was taken away. Amendment, of course, 26, that many of you may know, and that was simply to allow 18-year-olds to vote, which previously, okay, had been 21. And so that amendment, okay, and that came about largely because of the Vietnam War, where people said, well, if young men at the age of 18 could be drafted, okay, they should at least also have the right to vote. And so that became law in the early 1970s. One other feature that I would like to mention with regard to voting is that in 1924, the Native Americans were given citizenship, ironically. And in 1924, by being given citizenship, that also gave them the right to vote. So the right to vote, if you will, okay, has had this kind of history. The 14th Amendment, okay, especially because of its importance today, is one that we should take a good look at. And so therefore, we're going to take a look at the four different sections of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. The first and the third and fourth are particularly significant. The first is all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. I read this, but you should know that in 1866, just a couple of years after, or just about a year after the Civil War ended, the Congress had passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The intention of that is pretty much within this amendment. However, there were so many things that were being done that were essentially combating and going against the Civil Rights Act, that this is why they ended up having to put much of that within the 14th Amendment in order to give it greater gravitas, okay, than the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The importance are, and we'll take it one section at a time. So the first clause of the 14th Amendment, okay, where it talks about all persons born or naturalized, subject of the jurisdiction to thereof, are citizens of the United States. The language seems to be pretty clear, and this is intentional simply because this is the end of the Civil War. One of the ends of the Civil War was indeed, okay, to make sure that African Americans, okay, were to be guaranteed their freedom. So the purpose behind this was now to make sure that they were going to be, okay, free and therefore have their rights assured within our Constitution. This 14th Amendment was overturning the Dred Scott decision of 1857, in which the Supreme Court had ruled that black people, slaves in particular, were property, and therefore they did not have the rights that, okay, other people had. And this was directly overturning that decision. And so that's why this became so important as an amendment to the Constitution, as opposed to simply an act of Congress, as I was indicating earlier. This is the first time that the Constitution actually describes or defines what a citizen is, or who a citizen should be. Of course, today, we do have a significant issue that is being discussed, and that is, should children of undocumented immigrants born in the United States automatically become citizens? This is not an issue we're going to decide tonight, but it's an issue, okay, that directly relates to the 14th Amendment. So whether or not, okay, the 14th Amendment as written, okay, should be adhered to, or whether or not, okay, there should be a consideration. This case will be heard by the Supreme Court in its next session, okay, in 2025, from October, okay, through the early part of 2026. Then we have another due process of law, okay, that we're talking about as well. We talked about this last week when we talked about the Fifth Amendment. And John asked a question last week that I did not answer correctly. But if you have your constitutions with you, if you look at the Fifth Amendment, because I didn't answer the question very well last week, but if you look at the Fifth Amendment, I think I will answer John's question with more. So the Congress, whenever, excuse me, I'm not on the right page. It helps when you get to the right page. Page 27. Note the first two words. no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger, nor shall any person be subject to the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy or life or limb, nor shall be compelled to in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So last week, John asked, is there any reason why or are only citizens guaranteed to be protected by the Constitution? So the reason I read that is it's very clear that the Constitution says no person. So look at the 14th Amendment and look what it says. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Similar to the Fifth Amendment, and why is that important? Yes, sir.
Roger, could you just explain what the difference between what the founders described as born or naturalized?
Okay. Yep. Okay, born obviously means, okay, you're in the country at the time of your birth. Naturalized means you came to this country, and then after 5 years, which is normal, but after maybe 7 years, if you were, say, a refugee, or you were someone who came over here as an asylum type of immigrant, you have a time frame whereby you have to be in this country, and then you have to take an oath and then become a citizen. So that's what a naturalized citizen is. That's a very important question. Thanks for asking it, Bill. Yeah. So naturalized citizen is someone who comes to this country, was born in a different country, but then after a period of time, depending upon how long they've been in this country. And there are different time frames for that. So, for example, when some Vietnamese came over here after the Vietnam War, they were here, I believe they had to be here for 7 years before they could ask to be citizens. Similarly, other refugees from Cuba, okay, they had a period of time that they had to be here for a period of time. And they had to then study the Constitution, and in some cases they knew more about the Constitution than we do. So, and then they would have to take the test, and they would then become citizens. Yep. Anyone else? Yes.
I'm just curious, but when the language came out of all the persons as far as being civil rights, I assume in the context of the time, it was to have a language that was inclusive of Native Americans and blacks and anyone at that time. Is there any clear evidence of discussions at the time that it was intended to be more global than just including those groups?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, in the context of the time, when we were dealing with the naturalization of the black population and incorporating American Indians, were those the two groups that were seeking to find global language to cover without referring to one or the other specifically, versus, globally anticipating anything in the future?
Well, this was not unusual in other countries, so it's not something that other countries weren't familiar with. So in other words, we're not the only countries, okay, that had immigration type of issues. if I'm understanding what you're saying, these were kind of normal types of laws that were created, so that when people would come over to the country in order to become citizens, or thought that they would want to become citizens, there were always different rules and regulations that would dictate, okay, what would happen to them when and if they wish or decided to become citizens. Unless I'm not understanding your question. We can talk about this in another time. For some reason, I'm not understanding the question, I think. Sorry.
I should have been more clear, but
Well,
we'll try it again later.
okay. So it introduced a new principle called incorporation. I'm just going to describe it. The incorporation principle means the following: that the different rights that were in the Bill of Rights would need to be incorporated into the states, or have the states be addressing. They would have to address those rights when the Supreme Court would decide that those rights needed to be also followed by the states. So not all of the rights in the Bill of Rights have to be followed by the states. It happens when someone in a state will say, I should have the right to double jeopardy, not to be tried for the same crime. And so then that case goes to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court says, you're right. States should also apply double jeopardy to any case that occurs within the state. And in 1932, that's what happened. So now double jeopardy cannot be deprived of anybody in any state. Similarly, the same thing with the capital crimes. The same thing happened in 1963 with the Gideon versus Wainwright case, when a person, wanted to have a lawyer, and he did not have the money for a lawyer, and he wanted to have a lawyer present because he was too poor to have a lawyer, and then it became a part of every state now needs to provide a lawyer for any capital crimes committed within a state. So those are the kinds of things that are part of what is called incorporation. Yes?
So I've been operating under a misunderstanding for a long time, so I'm really glad I'm here. Because I thought that states had to provide the same level as the federal government, but they could exceed that in certain areas. But it sounds like there was, historically we had the Constitution, but we had a real separation from the federal government and the states, and that we had to fight to get the states up to the intention that was in the Constitution? It appears that way now.
Well, most of the rights within the Bill of Rights have been incorporated. So to get
time in your
absolutely. There's only about there's about 4 or 5 rights that haven't yet been incorporated. So most of the 27 rights have been incorporated, but there's about 4 or 5 that have not.
And some of this is happening in our lifetimes, those are some
Right. But it's not a major issue. I probably shouldn't have addressed it, but
I think it's important though, because things come up and people, some of the information that I've learned here on the Second Amendment has come up in conversations when people have challenged me on something or asked me something, and having better information, being more informed. have been able to enter into respectful dialogue,
Right.
so I appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just have a question. Is the Bill of Rights considered a component of the Constitution? In other words, if you say, is it really just a full amendment, or are the two documents standing at equal level?
Once an amendment is approved, okay, through the process that's outlined, it is the Constitution.
It's-
Yeah. In other words, once the amendment goes through the process with very laborious, very time, okay, it's a very difficult process. It's not an easy one. But once that's gone, you go through and it's an amendment of the Constitution, it is the Constitution.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, the equal protection of the law, this will surprise you, I believe, but the word equal, this is the first time that it appears in the Constitution. So we believe about equality, we talk about equality a lot, and it's an important part of our thinking, and it doesn't mean that it isn't an important part of the thinking of the founders or the framers, but the word itself does not appear in the Constitution until the 14th Amendment. However, what it refers to is the equal protection of the laws, okay, is extremely important, and it has been an extremely valuable part since the 14th Amendment. We cannot deny any person, again, person, not citizen, within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. It prohibits unreasonable discrimination. So here we go back to our preamble. And I go back to this largely because we want to make sure that we understand what we were talking about, okay, when we first did this in the first week of the lecture. Here we want to talk about it from the point of view of the purpose of the government, the 6 different purposes of the government. This is the popular sovereignty. This is our role. This is what we, the people, not just the government, to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. We're involved in this process. Provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. We're involved in this process. And secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So, again, making sure that the goals of government will be able to protect the lives, the liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for the people. Yes?
Did the 14th Amendment initially exclude women?
For what?
Well, they didn't have property rights.
No. When you say exclude women, it's not excluding women from criminal, okay, things of that nature. In other words, if you're talking about it from their political rights, yes.
Okay.
But not from any of the rights, okay, that we're talking about with regard to accused rights and things of that nature. No.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah. The summary and preview. Virtues are the what, principles are the how, institutions are by what means. So this is, in our discussion, we have to understand what individuals should aspire to, and that the people through their government should exemplify, and what they should exemplify. And today, the principles, meaning the ideas of how the government should achieve its goals and purposes. The institutions are what they created by what means, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. So let's look at the background of the institutions. So what brought about the institutions as they became established by the framers? So let's go back to John Adams and his essay called Thoughts on Government. There is no good government but what is republican, that the only part, or the only valuable part of the British Constitution is so, because the very definition of a republic is an empire of laws and not of men. So as we review his Thoughts on Government that he wrote, remember, in April of 1776, before the Declaration of Independence, we see that he's thinking about a republican government with an emphasis on an empire of laws and not of men. It's so important as the basis of our founders as they go forward in designing their state and central governments. In other words, as they go forward in order to make their governments, they're looking to design their governments as a government of laws, not of men. So let's look at the state constitutions. Remember, they're going from colonial charters to state constitutions. And this starts even before the Declaration, was written. So they're transitioning from colonial charters to statehood. Many of them only did one thing, and that is change it from charter to constitution. They didn't make a lot of significant changes. Then others, made more changes by moving away from a strong executive, and they emphasized their legislature. And by emphasizing their legislature, that meant that they were emphasizing the people's role, the people's voice within their states. Now, the Massachusetts Constitution was the last one of the 13 to actually do their constitution. And John Adams was the architect. Well, he's observing all these other states. And these other states aren't necessarily, doing a lot of great things. These legislative supremacy, as they call them, where the emphasis is on, the people, if you will, and their votes in the legislature, aren't really thriving, aren't really doing that well. And so John Adams is thinking, maybe we should do more along the line of what Montesquieu talked about with regard to the separation of powers. Maybe we should have, a stronger executive. Maybe we should have an independent judiciary. Remember, he talked about that himself. And maybe we should have, a legislature that isn't quite as strong as some of these other states. So he wrote up a constitution that had a little bit more of that in the Massachusetts Constitution. His first rendition was voted down. And he wrote another one. And that one, was accepted. Now, for representation, he decided that only those with lots of property would vote for the governor. Then the next tier of people with property would vote for the Senate. And then the general court would be the remainder of those with enough property. So it wasn't like it was opening up the floodgates, if you will, of everyone voting. They hadn't gotten there yet. But there was a difference, and ironically, the Massachusetts Constitution became a model for our U.S. Constitution. And just for a piece of trivia, the Massachusetts Constitution is the oldest constitution that exists in the world today. We still go by the 1780 Constitution, and it's the oldest, still working Constitution. So Was there a need for a central government? Because we just talked about states. Well, they thought so. But they thought only for limited purpose. They weren't too excited over the fact of having, umbrella organization telling them what to do. And of course, they didn't know what kind of government they wanted to be under. So they wanted definitely a weak central government, and one of the weakest around, something called a confederation. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. Now, one of the things that I find very attractive and one of the things that I think is very interesting about our founders is, you can go to the next slide, Jeff, is that notice when they started the discussion on the central government. Anything come at you or stare at you with the date?
After the 4th.
Yeah, it's only 8 days after the 4th of July. I mean, they have declared independence on the 4th of July, and all of a sudden they're already thinking about creating a central government. I mean, to me, this is telling me how serious these people are. They're not just talking about, okay, let's get our independence. They're also thinking we need a central government that's going to operate and tell us how we can work to defend ourselves. So it's pretty remarkable when you think of how deliberate they were and how thoughtful they were about the need for a central government. That didn't mean, that they wanted, tremendous action. It just means that they were deliberate enough to realize how important it was to create this kind of government. The wording of that was not completed and accepted by the Second Continental Congress until November 15th of 1777. And now that needed to go to all the states to be ratified. And that wasn't done until March the 1st of 1781. Took a long time. Matter of fact, there was a lot of what you might call arm twisting, especially Maryland. Maryland didn't want to accept the Articles of Confederation until the French said, "You want your coastline protected?" And Maryland realized they needed it protected, and they approved. So what's a confederation? Well, we have lots of confederations that exist even today. So the United Nations is a confederation. Some people will say, well, the United Nations doesn't work that well. Well, it was never intended to actually work that well, because the United Nations is aimed to do one thing, right? To keep the peace in the world. One can argue it hasn't done it all that successfully. On the other hand, one can argue that it's done a pretty credible job of actually doing it without getting a lot of credit for doing it. So I guess it depends on your perspective. But its primary job is to do that. You've probably heard of OPEC. oil-producing, exporting countries. And what do? Well, they set pretty much the standard of how much money is going to be costing for the barrels of oil that they produce. And that's in order to preserve their ability to be able to, make money for their particular country. But at the same time, keep supply and demand in such a way that's going to allow them to be able to make it work for their particular countries. Yes, sir.
So could you say a confederation would be an aggregation of different interests with a common goal?
That's correct. But typically with a singular type of purpose. In other words, they're not trying to do political things, about other things than that one purpose. So they're looking to try and do something that's going to help their particular cause. In this particular case, they're looking at defending all of the 13, states. And they see that as an important end as they are fighting against the British. And so in order to fight the British, the 13 colonies see that as an important end and purpose. And so the Articles of Confederation are going to join together, or they're going to join the 13 colonies for that end. And so that's what they're attempting to do, and that's what they're hoping will be the end result. This confederation is made up of only one branch of government, a legislature. They call it the Confederation Congress. And they, as a result, have no executive and no judicial branch. Just so you don't get confused, they do elect a president with a one-year term, but the president is merely the presiding officer. In other words, what the word president actually means. So it's just the person who runs the meetings, so to speak. So, in short, in the Articles of Confederation, the purpose was to defend the states. The sovereignty are the states. So the states are the ones who determine, what the articles or what the Confederation Congress can do. As I said, it's one branch is the legislative. Delegates, every state can send 2 to 7 delegates. However, when they vote on any kind of legislation, every state has 1 vote. So if you have 7 members, you vote, and it's got to be 4 to 3. Well, that whatever 4 to 3, that's the 1 vote that you get. If you got 2 members and they don't agree, too bad, your state doesn't get to vote. To make a law, 9 out of the 13 states, would have to vote to make a law. And amendments, you have to have unanimity. So all 13 states have to work. So these last 2 are kind of difficult, because just to show you how people really weren't vested in this central government, it was very rare when they had meetings where more than 9 ever met together. 10 was pretty much the max when they had 10 delegates from a state. And unanimity? There weren't any amendments. So here are the concerns. These are very important. No taxing power. So I'll just give you a very flat example. It existed from 1781 until 1788. During that time, they asked the states for over $16 million, and they received about $1 million. And they had no power to get any more. How would a government, operate, if they couldn't get money from the states? No power to enforce agreements with foreign nations. So, again, if you think about that, that wouldn't work too well either, would it? So they would enter into agreements in order to get treaties with each different form of government, like Great Britain, France, Spain, Netherlands. And then the privateers, ships owned by individuals, would defy all those agreements that were made with those countries, and they would, trade with the countries, on their own. And there were no penalties. No power to regulate trade among the states. Well, we have states that have rivers that border each side. So you have the Hudson River that New York and New Jersey border, and they have issues. You have the Potomac that shares a border with Maryland and Virginia, and the ships, have issues. Similarly, you have the Delaware River with New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and no government can solve their problems. No power to regulate citizens' behavior. For example, we have a treaty of Paris in 1783. One of the things that they agreed to was the Americans agreed that the loyalists, those who were fighting for the British, would get their properties back, or at least payment for their properties. Nope. Some states, refused to allow that to happen, and so people didn't follow the wording of the treaties. And there was no enforcement power. Remember, there was no judicial branch. I don't need to go on, do I? Can you understand, that this Articles of Confederation did not have a great deal of power? And then there was Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion here in Massachusetts. You had people who had not, soldiers who had not been paid their wages for fighting in the American Revolution. Result? They couldn't keep their farms. Were they upset? They started to fight, and they were going to, try to take over the arsenal, in Springfield, Massachusetts. Now, your sympathy, would go to those farmers. But here's the problem. If that was going to be dealt with that way, what's going to happen to creditors who are now going to no longer want to give credit to anyone because they're fearing that they will never get paid? Economically, it throws a monkey wrench into everything that is going to now need to take place. So property owners in the other states are all looking at, if the Shays' Rebellion isn't put down, and if Shays' Rebellion gets repeated in all of their states, chaos is going to exist, and this is going to cause chaos everywhere. So the result of everything I've just discussed with you gets leaders in every state to think what? And we better get a new constitution. So, the original decision by the Confederation Congress was, well, we'll set up a new constitutional convention with their purpose to fix the Articles of Confederation. Well, when they got to Philadelphia, they did more than fix. They got to the Philadelphia Convention. It was supposed to start in May 14th of 1787, and they didn't have representation from the majority of the states. And they waited, and they waited. And finally, they got the majority, by May 25th. I'd have to think that poor James Madison, who had been laboring and working extraordinarily hard, he had been studying, researching, and doing all kinds of work. He had prepared a plan called the Virginia Plan that he thought, would be the perfect antidote to the Articles of Confederation. And you got to be thinking, oh my God, he's here on May 14th, nobody's here on May 15th, nobody's here on May 18th, nobody's here on May 20th, not enough are coming. Are they going to come? Are they going to make it? Finally, on May 25th, they have a majority, and they start their session. Edmund Randolph reads James Madison's Virginia Plan to everyone, that's present. Oh my God. It's vastly different from the Articles of Confederation. Hugely different. And we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. Bottom line is, just take a look at those numbers. Was everybody serious about this new Constitution? 78 people were chosen to be delegates. At no time did 55 members ever show up. At the end, there were 42 people that were there, and 39 approved. One state never showed up. You might say we were lucky we got a Constitution. Some of the famous people there were George Washington, and he almost didn't want to go. I shouldn't say he almost didn't want to go. He didn't want to go. The fact that he went, most people would say was probably the reason why it was successful, because he was probably the most trustworthy person that attended. Benjamin Franklin was the oldest. I think he was 81 at the time of his attendance. James Madison, he was the author of the Virginia Plan, as I've just mentioned, but he later will be called the father of the Constitution. William Patterson, in a few moments you'll find out, he was the person who responded an antidote to the Virginia Plan by writing the New Jersey Plan. Governor Morris, he's the one who actually wrote all the words to the Constitution. He's the guy who basically took everything that everybody said from May 25th through the beginning of September and put it all together. Alexander Hamilton, he gave a big speech in June, left, came back and voted for it. And Roger Sherman, was the guy who came up with the great compromise that he's noted for. We'll talk about that. Here are some big names that never showed up, but they were busy, some of them. John Adams, was the ambassador to Great Britain after the war. Thomas Jefferson was the ambassador to France. Of course, there was Patrick Henry, and as he said, he smelled a rat.
Roger,
Yes.
you have Madison down as the author of the Virginia Plan, but you introduced, to me it was an introduction, to George Mason. How much was he behind that Virginia Plan, and was he in attendance?
George Mason was in attendance, and he was a very important delegate. However, he was one of the three that chose not to sign the Constitution. And his reason, as we will get to know, was because he wanted a Bill of Rights. And when they chose not to write a Bill of Rights at the time of the convention, he chose not to not sign the Constitution.
Interesting man.
Very interesting, and one of our best and one of our greatest founders. Because if you notice, last week I talked about the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which he wrote. He was one of our most outstanding, founders. But he chose not to sign the Constitution of the United States. Because it did not contain a Bill of Rights. But maybe it's premature for me to say this, but in response to your question, the importance of a Bill of Rights, which you note is how much it was meant to him because of his Declaration of Rights for Virginia. You have to think about the fact that in Philadelphia in 1787, it was one of the hottest summers, in the history, of Philadelphia. They had made a vow of secrecy, so they had put all of the windows or shades down, so that there was no one would know exactly what was going on. I mean, I want you to think about that in today's culture. They were sworn that they would not talk about anything that they were deliberating, for the simple purpose that they wanted everybody to be able to change their minds. They didn't want people to say, well, this is what I think on this day, and then 2 weeks later not be able to change their mind because they had publicly made a statement. So everybody was sworn to secrecy to allow everybody to think for themselves and be able to change their minds if they were convinced they could. So they were very tired by the time they got to September. It was George Mason who, at the beginning of September, says, we need a Bill of Rights. And everybody is exhausted. And they are whipped, and they're saying, no, George. We've gone through this. We really don't need a Bill of Rights. And I'm going to talk about this at the end of our session. So you'll see the reasoning they come up with, but I really think it was their exhaustion that really prevented them from actually putting a Bill of Rights at that time.
Integrity and belief.
Right.
That kept him from not being able to.
That's correct. It was his belief, absolutely. So the forming of a government post Articles of Confederation. So you have his Virginia plan, and look at what he wants to do. Now you can see the contrast, right? He wants a strong national government. He wants a federal system. He wants 3 branches of government, 2 houses based on proportional representation, and he wants to be able to call out the armed forces if the states don't enforce congressional laws. Phew. Big contrast, wouldn't you think? Now, what I didn't write in there is, if you want proportional representation on both houses, who benefits? The larger states. So if all the larger states are going to get the benefit, who doesn't benefit? The smaller states. So here comes, New Jersey's William Patterson, who says, no. This is just not going to work. So he comes up with his plan, which essentially says, no, only one house with the power to levy tariffs and stamp tax to raise money, with a Supreme Court appointed by an executive branch. So he's basically saying, well, we're going to do the same thing as the Confederation Congress. In other words, the Articles of Confederation, but we're just going to do, we're going to have 3 branches of government, but they're not going to be all that strong. But we're going to also try to solve the problem of taxes by giving us a way to get taxes, but pretty weak, nonetheless. This was an impasse. that did not look like it was going to go very far. And at this particular point in time, I told you that Alexander Hamilton had left. There were two other New Yorkers that were there, and both of them, okay, were not very optimistic about the Constitutional Convention. So I told you that Rhode Island never showed up, so that meant that there were 12 states. Now there were 11, okay, New York leaves. Now there are 11 states. Other states are thinking, okay, this is not working out too well. Crisis is getting into the process. And so all of a sudden, it's looking like this Constitutional Convention is going to collapse. And in actuality, when Roger Sherman at the beginning of July turns around and says, well, let's do a compromise. Let's have the House of Representatives be elected with proportional representation so that the population of each state determines the number of people who are going to be in the House, and we'll have equal representation for the small states in the Senate. And let's see if that works. And then to placate and make sure that the larger, or excuse me, the issue of money bills originate in the House, which will represent the fact that the people speak, because the House will be the closest branch to the people. Since the House is elected every 2 years, as opposed to senators who are elected every 6 years. So, that worked by a vote of 6-5. Most scholars who study this issue will say that had this compromise not worked, the Constitutional Convention would probably have collapsed. This was the singular most important, okay, compromise. Yes, sir?
What kept the 5 states from just walking away saying, no, we're not going to vote?
Because they all knew that the articles, okay, were already collapsing. And they all knew that without some kind of central government, they could not essentially operate, okay, solo. In other words, it wasn't their preference, it was more of they still understood that there was a need, okay, for cooperation. I mean, that's the reading that I would get from pretty much everything, you know, that's going on at that particular time. So it wasn't a perfect instrument, but based upon everything that they're debating and talking about and other things that are going on at the same time, this was an issue. It wasn't the issue, but it was probably the most important issue at that particular time. There were other, so we've already talked about the preamble, so we know what the 6 purposes are. Sovereignty is we the people, not the states, the people. Different, big difference. The branches of government, we know are 3. We've talked about the delegates, proportional versus equal. Every representative has their independent vote. So every member of the House, their vote is their vote. Every senator, their vote is their vote. Majority vote, making laws, in 3/4 of the states, okay, in order to make amendments to the Constitution. We have other compromises. Some of them weren't so pretty. So we have several, okay, that deal with slavery. Okay, slavery was extremely important, as you know, for the southern states. They weren't giving that up. So we have 3 compromises that ended up happening. What you need to know is they were compromises in the sense that each got an advantage from, okay, from the other. So you have, for example, Southerners' advantage is, if you count 3/5 of all the slaves, it increased the population. If you increase the population, that gives them more, okay, votes. They give them more power. They have more members of the House of Representatives. So 3/5 of the population is good for them. Where did the northern states get as an advantage? They pay more taxes. The southern states pay more taxes because they're now going to be paying more per person from the southern states, because they're paying 3/5 more by population.
I've heard it said, and from a couple of different sources, on the 3/5, I heard the opposite spin to it, and that you listed it as a southern advantage, and I understand what you're saying, but I've also heard it said that it was the reduction of 2/5 was the northern advantage because they gained less power by only having 3/5.
No, they gained greater power, because now they have a greater say in the number of people in the House.
But it had each slave been fully represented 5/5, 100%, they would have gained more power.
Well, of course. Well, that's where but that's where the compromise comes.
Right. Okay.
The northern states were not going to allow them to count them fully.
Right. Okay.
That's where the compromise comes in. But the southern states are now going to have to pay more to the government, okay, 3/5 more, because of counting the slaves.
Okay. Thank you.
The Fugitive Slave Clause, huge. Slaves were trying to escape all the time. Put in the Fugitive Slave Clause, now that means that if slaves were caught in the North, they had to be returned to the South, to their owners. So the law, okay, would require that. And then you have the 20-year delay on banning the slave trade, and this, okay, was an advantage to the South, but at the same time, it allowed for the banning of the slave trade, which was notoriously opposed by many northern states, because they didn't like, okay, the fact of going to Africa, getting, okay, more slaves, bringing them across the ocean, etc. But the advantage to the South was they didn't see that as a loss, because now that they had these slaves, they could breed them and keep their slaves growing within the United States. Then you had presidential compromises. The debates were very wide here. Some people wanted to have 3 presidents, and 3 presidents, okay, would be in charge of 3 different areas. One for finance, one for law, and the law, and in other words, they would have 3 different responsibilities. They ended up, obviously, okay, with 1. Then the number of offices, a number of years, rather, that they would be in. They wanted a 1-term president with a 7-year term. They wanted 2 years, okay, and then they said, well, we'll just use 4-year terms, which is what they ended up with. Then they argued about the responsibilities of what should a president do. What should their jobs be? What would their functions be? And then they argued over how strong should the executive be, or how limited, okay, should the president be. And there were tremendous arguments on that, because they just came from, okay, having the British, okay, king, and they didn't want anything of that nature. And on the other hand, they also came from states, okay, with constitutions where they didn't have strong executives, and they saw how weak that was. Let's look at the legislature. Article 1 is considered the most important part, and if you look at your constitutions, you'll see that that's the largest part of the Constitution. Article 1 is about the legislature. And it was because that was the closest to the people. The people had the greatest say with the legislature. So they felt that that should have the greatest amount of say. Of course, that would be primarily with the House of Representatives, and you can see some of those reflections within it. So the 2-year term for the House meant that they would have a greater opportunity for the people to be able to make their case. If they didn't like, okay, what the representatives were doing, they could get them out of office and select another person. At least in their view, that's what they were thinking. The powers of Congress are in the 8th section of Article 1. There are 18 clauses in that section. Most of those clauses are areas that you would recognize because they were things that they were trying to solve within the areas that the Articles of Confederation, had lapsed. So you had the taxing powers, you had the spending powers, you have the commerce powers, you have all these other things that they were trying to, make sure were not going to be hindrances that they were before. So those are the kinds of things. You have 2 branches, which you already know. How a bill becomes a law, of course, is a huge thing. I think most of you are familiar with that. The importance of committees. They didn't talk a lot about that, but you should know that to make laws today, the committee's structure is extremely important because the committees are those things that allow for the various committees they're the ones who need to know the substance of what a bill is supposed to be about, and how those bills, are formulated, and how they're made up, and how those bills are supposed to do the work that they're supposed to do. So you have standing committees, which essentially, armed forces, agriculture, education. So all committees that reference, veterans committees reference those areas that particularly aimed at the kinds of legislations that they would be working on. The most important committees are Ways and Means Committee, the Rules Committee. Those are the committees, that are probably the most essential that need to be done. Specific positions, there are only one position in the in the legislature for the House that's mentioned in the Constitution. It's the Speaker of the House that's mentioned. In the Senate, it's the Vice President. The Vice President has a role in the legislature only when there's a tie in the vote, and that's when the Vice President, gets to break the tie. Otherwise, the President pro tempore is a position that is voted on. It's usually the oldest member of the Senate. However, that position can vary and is often, a different person from time to time. Now, the executive. Look at all the things he can do and was expected to do. So at the State of the Union address, he usually tells everybody what he wants, to do, the legislation. He, until present time, who knows, hopefully that'll change at some point, recommends legislation to Congress. He can call special sessions of Congress. He delivers a message like the State of the Union. He can sign or veto legislation. He appoints federal judges, appoints and heads of federal departments, cabinet, and other agencies, appoints representatives to foreign countries, ambassadors, carries business with foreign nations, acts as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and can issue pardons. These are all the duties and the things in which the president has the power to do. The judicial branch, the only, yes, sir?
Is not some of those with the consent of Congress? Like federal judges have to be voted on by the Senate?
That's very important. Part of the checks and balances that we talked about last week, okay, indicate that the president nominates federal judges, he appoints ambassadors, he appoints or nominates people for cabinet positions. All of those have to be approved by the Senate. Yeah, so that's part of the checks and balances that we were talking about. Yep. So his job is to nominate, but many of these positions, okay, must be approved by the Senate. So the Supreme Court is the only court that is defined in the Constitution. However, the court does indicate that the Congress will have the power to create other inferior courts. So right now we have 13 appellate courts. 11 of those are courts, as you can see from the map, okay, are all over the country. We are in the first appellate court district. The second includes New York and Connecticut, Vermont. So those are the appellate courts. To get to the appellate court, you typically go to the federal district court, and there are 94 of those. And the larger states obviously have several district courts, and those are the basic format. But there are many, many other courts, the customs courts and the claims courts, international trade courts. There are a lot of other courts that are specific to different types of concerns. But these are the major ones. By the way, when I say the 13 appellate courts, there's been talk about breaking up the Ninth Court because the Ninth Court is extremely large. Some people want to break up the court and give California its own federal appellate court. California is so large that they're thinking that they might do that. I don't know if it will, but they've been talking about it for years. So I don't know if that's going to happen. So before we get into the ratification, I just want to go back to the fact that on September 17th, 1787, 238 years ago today, okay, we had 42 people in the room, and they all came together and were supposed to sign the Constitution. And 3 people decided not to. One of them was George Mason. The other was Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts. And the other one was Edmund Randolph, okay, from Virginia. And all of them, okay, the 3 of them decided for whatever reasons, okay, that they didn't want to sign the Constitution. The other 42, okay, put their names on this document that we now call the Constitution of the United States. So 238 years ago. But that didn't mean anything. Didn't mean anything other than the fact that those people decided that this Constitution should govern our country. Now it had to be ratified. So Article 7 of the Constitution essentially says that every state had to ratify it. Well, no, that's not true. Not every state. Only 9 of them had to. Imagine if every state had to do it and Rhode Island never participated in the first place. What's the likelihood of Rhode Island, okay, going along? Not too much, right? So they ended up putting into the Article 7, Article 7, they said 9 of the 13 states had to ratify. So who's doing the ratifying? They decided to do what Massachusetts did. They decided to have a ratifying convention whose sole purpose was to ratify the Constitution. Now, that's what they did in Massachusetts. So this also bypassed, for political reasons, it bypassed the fact that some of these states weren't necessarily happy about this new, stronger national government. So it bypassed the state legislatures that existed in those states. So the ratifying convention was specifically going to vote for people whose sole purpose was to ratify the Constitution. So in the first few states, it went very quickly. No problem at all. Delaware was the first state. That's why it's given the designation as the Constitution state. Pennsylvania. That's why you look at the map that's up there. Oh, yeah. And you see Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, and then, Massachusetts. Massachusetts wasn't having it. They weren't too pleased about it. Matter of fact, we were part of Sutton at that time. And Amos Singletary was our representative. And he was not too pleased about this new Constitution. And he voted against it. But the delegates were promised that they would insert a Bill of Rights into this new Constitution. And that was just enough to get it over the wire. So by a very narrow margin, Massachusetts passed it. And then Maryland, South Carolina, and New Hampshire. Well, guess what? How many states is that? That's 9 states. Bingo. We're golden, right? Well, everybody knew that if Virginia and New York wasn't in, that was going to be not going to work. So there was, work to be done in order to get the two, and the two finally did approve in July of 1788. And so finally, with Virginia and then New York, the ratification process, was allowed, and the Constitution did get done. So what we need to talk about right now is one of the final and most important aspects of something that we started talking about earlier. And that is the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. In this process, for ratification, the first states that we talked about that passed it right away came about largely because the Federalists had the momentum. And so therefore, they were able to really get people out there to pass and get people gung-ho about the Constitution. But as it lingered, people started reading this Constitution, and they started to have doubts. Oh, wait a minute. this really going to work? Is this going to make it? And they started to, complain. So the anti-federalists, named, by the way, by the Federalists, Robert Yates from New York, he claimed himself as Brutus. He started writing about things that he did not like, about some of the things that had been decided. Elbridge Gerry, remember him? He decided not to sign the Constitution. Mercy Otis Warren from Massachusetts, Richard Henry Lee from Virginia, Melancton Smith, called himself the Federal Farmer from New York, many, many others started to write pieces against the Constitution. Well, the Federalists had three people who wrote a whole series of essays. John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. John Jay wrote a few, we think only about 5, and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton wrote the rest of the 85 essays. So when the Anti-Federalists would write an essay in the newspapers, the Federalists, would respond to their, point of view. And this is how these essays, became a fixture for how they were explaining what and why they wrote the Constitution the way they did, and the Anti-Federalists were raising objections as to why they were concerned about what they were hearing. So, what they were reading. So these are the very important. So I've selected 3 things, then we're going to end our session for tonight. And the reason I did, and you'll pick this up, I hope, is because of the 3 principles of government that we've been talking about. So they're talking about the Republican form of government. So if you're an anti-federalist, you're saying, well, we've had Republican forms of government in historical past, and those have always been for small areas of the world. And people who lived in those came with very common beliefs, common interests. That's why they worked, even though sometimes they worked for short periods of time. But we're a large area. The length of our country is about 1,000 miles. It's not going to work for 1,000 miles. There's no historical precedent for that. And the Federalists responded and said, well, we have an opportunity to demonstrate that when you have a large group and you have a large number of people, the number of factions that occur are going to be competing against each other. And when those factions occur, there's less of a likelihood that any one faction is ever going to, become a majority. If a large faction could become a majority, that would be very, very difficult in a large type of republic. And besides, in a large type of government, people will generally be greater at supporting the common good. A second issue, constitutionalism. If you're an anti-federalist, you would look and pick at different aspects of the Constitution, and you'd go all over the Constitution and say, wait a minute, this necessary and proper clause in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 of the Constitution says you can go ahead and you can make laws, that are necessary and proper as long as they okay, connect with a power of government, but that's going to allow you to, okay, broaden the rights of the government to get involved in all kinds of different things. That the president's power is unlimited. He can grant pardons. National courts can destroy the state courts. Treaties can be acting as supreme law of the land. Executive and legislatures could collude against the states. And remember, 65 House members for 3 million people. Nothing like 435 House members for 340 million. Federalists, on the other hand, were turning around and saying civic virtue cannot be relied upon to support a government to protect people's rights. In other words, his view, or James Madison was relating this in Federalist number 10, he says, factions are extremely, extremely important because, not factions, but the separation of powers and institutions are very, very important if we're going to be able to check those human nature tendencies that people have. If we don't have those kinds of institutions, okay, we could be in danger. And the way in which our representatives are chosen for the different aspects are all going to be different, and hopefully that will, okay, solve the problem, okay, of limited government. And then we have liberalism. This is the issue, of course, of the Bill of Rights. The issue, okay, of lacking a Bill of Rights. And that's what the Anti-Federalists, okay, jumped on. And to be honest with you, as I said with Massachusetts, this became a lightning rod, okay, for other states. And what ended up happening is the Federalists said, we will write a Bill of Rights once it is ratified. And they did, as you know. That's where the Bill of Rights in 1791 did get added to the Constitution, the 10 amendments, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. Of course, as I said to you, did they respond? How did they respond? Well, you don't really need them because the states are the really actors upon the people, and so there's really no need, okay, for a Bill of Rights. But I really think the biggest answer was they were tired. They were exhausted. And I think that was their biggest, okay, reason. There were other debates. Strong executive, supremacy clause, standing army. These were all other debates and beyond that they had. They were a lot of issues that they had going forward. So there's one takeaway that I want you all to have tonight. There's one huge thing that I want you to consider, okay, as you leave here tonight. The Anti-Federalists and the Federalists believed strongly in the principles of government. I didn't tell you anything about the fact that they did not believe in constitutionalism. I didn't say to you that they didn't believe in republicanism. I didn't tell you that they didn't believe in liberalism. What they disagreed about was the degree of whether or not there was enough limited government, whether or not there was enough, okay, republicanism, or whether or not there was enough, okay, issues with regard to liberalism. The issues were not about disagreeing about the principles of government. They were on board with those principles. They were disagreeing about how those principles should be protected. We need to keep that in mind. We need to keep that in mind for today's discussions. Thank you, and I hope to see you next week.